Hey guys! Tonight we're exploring medieval psychology, the ancient science of confidently guessing what was wrong with you and then bleeding about it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far this conversation travels. In medieval psychology, sadness was not an emotion. It wasn't grief, it wasn't stress, and it definitely wasn't the perfectly reasonable response to living in a damp hut while everyone you knew slowly died of preventable causes. No, sadness was a fluid problem. Specifically, it was black bile, a cold, dry, mysterious substance medieval scholars imagined sloshing around inside you like emotional tar. If you felt gloomy, it wasn't because life was hard, it was because your internal plumbing had failed. According to medieval theory, black bile caused melancholy, despair, brooding, and what doctors politely described as excessive thought. Thinking too much, by the way, was a medical red flag. Medieval psychology looked at introspection and said, absolutely not, that's how bile accumulates. The diagnosis was simple. Are you sad? Congratulations, you are full of bile. The treatment was even simpler. Remove the bile. How? Bloodletting, vomiting, laxatives, sweating, starving, occasionally all of them in one exciting afternoon. Medieval medicine responded to emotional exhaustion by saying, what if we also make you physically miserable and see which one wins? Doctors took this very seriously. They tracked how often you sighed, they monitored your sleep, they analyzed whether you stared into the distance too thoughtfully. A person who quietly reflected was considered more dangerous than someone loudly screaming. Silence meant bile was settling. Grief was treated the same way. If your spouse died, medieval psychology didn't recommend comfort, community, or time. It recommended a bowl, a blade, and a firm belief that emotions should be drained like spoiled wine. Creative people were especially doomed. Poets, artists, scholars, anyone who enjoyed thinking were considered prime candidates for melancholy. Creativity was tolerated only in small doses. Too much imagination caused bile buildup. Bile caused sadness. Sadness caused treatment. Treatment often caused death. A very efficient system. And here's the best part. If you survived the treatment, the doctor declared success. If you didn't, the problem was technically resolved. Either way, medieval psychology congratulated itself. In a strange way, turning sadness into a substance made it feel controllable. You couldn't understand your emotions, but you could extract them. You couldn't heal your mind, but you could weaken your body until it stopped complaining. Unfortunately, sadness is not a liquid. Black bile does not exist, and bleeding someone does not cure despair. But medieval psychology didn't know that, and it was extremely confident. Once sadness had been solved as a fluid problem, medieval psychology made another bold discovery. Thinking itself was risky behavior. Not dangerous philosophically, dangerous in a your brain might overheat and ruin your life sense. Reflection, analysis, and prolonged thought were considered health hazards. According to medieval scholars, the brain was delicate, soft, moist, and extremely sensitive to vibes. So if you thought too much, you generated excess heat. That heat dried the brain, a dried brain led to madness, and madness usually ended with chains. So medieval psychology advised moderation in all intellectual activity. You were encouraged to think just enough to do your job, say your prayers, and not ask follow-up questions. Curiosity was tolerated briefly, then monitored closely. Scholars warned that excessive study, reading late at night, or concentrating too intently could cause mental collapse. Imagine being told that learning Latin was medically risky. Medieval psychology looked at education and said, careful, that's how it starts. Students were advised to take breaks from thinking, long breaks, ideally permanent ones. Overexerting the mind was believed to drain vital spirits, disturb the humors, and invite melancholy. In other words, thinking too hard made your bile angry again. Everything always came back to bile. The truly unfortunate were philosophers. Medieval society admired philosophers in theory, but distrusted them in practice. A philosopher who asked too many questions wasn't seen as insightful, he was seen as courting insanity. If you stared into space too often, people assumed your brain was overheating and quietly rearranging itself. And then there were women. Medieval psychology believed women were especially vulnerable to thinking-related disorders because their brains were supposedly colder, wetter, and more emotionally reactive. This meant serious intellectual thought wasn't just inappropriate, it was medically irresponsible. Education for women wasn't discouraged only for ideological reasons, it was discouraged for their own health. Even dreams were suspicious. Vivid dreams meant the imagination was running unchecked, which implied mental imbalance. Sleep was supposed to be passive. If it wasn't, something was wrong. The safest mental state, according to medieval psychology, was mild awareness paired with obedience. Think a little, feel a little. Never too much of either. Modern psychology encourages reflection. Medieval psychology encouraged a nap. And honestly, given the circumstances, that might have been the healthiest advice they accidentally gave. Once medieval psychology decided thinking could cook your brain, it made another important discovery. Anger was not emotional, it was internal combustion. Specifically, it was your liver overheating like a poorly ventilated furnace. According to medieval theory, anger came from an excess of yellow bile, a hot, dry substance produced by the liver. If you were calm, your liver was behaving. If you were angry, your liver was throwing a tantrum. Emotional regulation wasn't about self-control, it was about temperature management. Rage had nothing to do with frustration, injustice, or the fact that medieval life was objectively awful. You were angry because your organs were too warm. The solution was obvious: cool the body, calm the bile, and tell the liver to stop acting up. Treatments included cold baths, cooling diets, and bloodletting, because apparently removing blood was medieval medicine's answer to everything. If someone had a temper, doctors might recommend avoiding spicy food, alcohol, sex, and excitement. In short, avoid everything that made life tolerable. Medieval psychology also believed chronic anger could physically warp your personality. Angry people were described as sharp, bitter, aggressive, and difficult, which, to be fair, isn't entirely wrong. But instead of therapy or conflict resolution, the advice was simple: reduce heat, eat cold foods, sit quietly, do not argue. Ideally, stop having opinions. Men were believed to be more prone to anger because their bodies were naturally hotter. This conveniently explained violence while excusing it. Women, being colder and wetter, were thought to be less angry, unless their moisture went wrong, in which case they became hysterical. Medieval psychology was very proud of how neatly it explained everything while understanding nothing. Even righteous anger was discouraged. Excess passion of any kind was dangerous. A man who shouted too much wasn't standing up for himself, he was medically unbalanced. A woman who expressed anger at all was a separate problem involving prayer. In medieval courts, anger was sometimes treated as evidence of poor health rather than bad behavior. If you lashed out, the assumption wasn't that you were wrong, it was that your liver needed intervention. Affability was optional, cooling was mandatory. Modern psychology sees anger as a response to stimuli. Medieval psychology saw it as a temperature issue. If only all emotional problems could be solved with fewer spices and a nice cold bath. After blaming sadness on bile and anger on overheated organs, medieval psychology turned its attention to love and immediately decided love was not romantic, poetic, or meaningful. Love was a diagnosable illness, temporary, dangerous, and best handled by someone with a knife and a bowl. This condition was known as lovesickness, and medieval scholars treated it with the seriousness usually reserved for plague outbreaks. Falling in love caused paleness, insomnia, loss of appetite, obsessive thinking, sudden poetry writing, and an alarming tendency to stare at nothing while smiling. In other words, medieval psychology accidentally described being in love and then panicked. Doctors believed love disrupted the balance of the humors, overheating the heart and drying the brain.
Too much passion sent vital spirits racing through the body like excited children in a monastery. This was unhealthy. Order had been lost. Fluids were misbehaving again.
A lovesick person, according to medieval psychology, might sigh excessively, avoid food, speak in metaphors, and lose interest in practical labor. If a peasant stopped plowing his field because he was thinking about someone's eyes, this was not considered devotion. It was considered a medical emergency. Treatment varied, but none of it involved happiness. Cold baths were common because medieval medicine firmly believed romance could be rinsed away. Bloodletting was also popular because if you were thinking too much about love, you clearly had too much blood. Dietary changes were recommended as well. Bland food, no spices, no wine, no excitement, and absolutely no contact with the person you loved. Exposure therapy was not part of the plan. In more severe cases, doctors advised marriage, not as a celebration of love, but as containment. If the object of affection was unavailable, the solution was distraction. Travel, prayer, physical labor, or intense supervision were all prescribed. Feelings were not explored. They were redirected, like inconvenient river water. Women diagnosed with lovesickness were treated as emotionally unstable. Men were treated as temporarily foolish. This double standard was not subtle. Medieval psychology rarely was. The most tragic part was that love was only tolerated when it behaved itself. Controlled affection within marriage was acceptable. Passion, longing, obsession, desire, deeply suspicious. Love was allowed only in small, regulated doses, like a dangerous medicine. Modern psychology sees love as attachment, chemistry, and connection. Medieval psychology saw it as a fever, and like all medieval fevers, the solution was to drain something until the problem stopped moving. By this point, medieval psychology had explained sadness with bile, anger with overheated organs, and love with feverish insanity. Naturally, it then turned to women and said, yes, this is their fault, scientifically. According to medieval thinkers, women were more emotional not because of social conditions, limited rights, constant childbirth, or the fact that medieval life was relentlessly brutal. No, women were emotional because they were wetter, colder, more moist, psychologically soggy. This theory was taken very seriously. Medieval psychology believed the ideal human temperament was hot and dry. Dryness meant stability. Heat meant energy. Men, conveniently, were described as naturally hotter and drier, which explained why they were rational, authoritative, and allowed to speak in public without supervision. Women, on the other hand, were believed to be colder and wetter. Moisture, according to medieval science, caused instability. Thoughts slipped around. Reason failed to harden. The mind, like damp bread, simply refused to behave. This moisture theory explained everything medieval society already wanted to believe. Emotional expression, moisture. Crying, excess fluid escaping. Anger, improper distribution. Intelligence, possible but risky. Too much thinking could overheat an already damp brain, which was obviously a problem. As a result, education for women was considered medically questionable. Intellectual activity might imbalance their humors, dry out their moisture, or worse, give them opinions. Medieval psychology framed restriction as protection. We're not limiting you, they said. We're preserving your health. Medical texts warned that women needed supervision, moderation, and control to maintain balance. Strong emotions were dangerous, not because they were powerful, but because they disrupted the fragile moisture equilibrium. Emotional regulation was not encouraged. Emotional containment was. Even childbirth reinforced these beliefs. Pregnancy and menstruation were interpreted as proof that women were governed by fluids. This made them mysterious, unpredictable, and therefore suspicious. Psychology became an excuse for social hierarchy.
What medieval scholars never considered was that maybe women were emotional because their lives were constrained, dangerous, and exhausting. That idea would have required thinking, and thinking, as we've established, was dangerous. Modern psychology recognizes emotion as human. Medieval psychology blamed water. And somehow this explanation survived for centuries, proving that confidence, not accuracy, is often the most persuasive force of all. Once medieval psychology finished blaming emotions on fluids, temperature, and dampness, it turned its attention to dreams, and immediately decided the brain could not possibly be responsible. Dreams were not random, they were not memory fragments, they were not the result of stress, digestion, or that questionable cheese you ate before bed. Dreams were messages. The only question was, messages from whom? According to medieval thinkers, dreams could come from God, angels, demons, the stars, your bodily humors, or your dinner, sometimes all at once. Interpretation was everything. A dream wasn't something you experienced, it was something you needed decoded before it ruined your life. Pleasant dreams were suspicious. Why was your mind so relaxed? What were you forgetting to repent for? Nightmares, on the other hand, were very useful. They could indicate sin, spiritual attack, demonic influence, or internal imbalance. Medieval psychology loved dreams, because no matter what happened, it was definitely your fault. Medical texts explained dreams as vapors rising from the stomach to the brain during sleep. Heavy vapors caused dark dreams. Light ones caused pleasant ones. Chaotic vapors meant you were ill. Digestion wasn't just important for health, it was shaping your subconscious. Dream interpretation manuals became wildly popular. These books listed symbols and meanings with impressive confidence. Snakes meant betrayal. Fire meant passion or damnation. Falling meant moral weakness. Teeth falling out meant something bad. It was never good. Dreams were rarely interpreted as neutral. Medieval psychology didn't believe in neutral mental experiences. Monks took dreams especially seriously. A single vivid dream could trigger days of prayer, fasting, and anxiety. Dreams were treated as evidence of temptation, evidence of divine testing, evidence that your mind was not under proper control. Even erotic dreams were considered moral failures, despite occurring while unconscious. Medieval psychology managed to invent guilt that operated independently of your awareness. You could sin in your sleep and still be held accountable. Truly impressive. Modern psychology sees dreams as the brain processing information. Medieval psychology saw them as supernatural performance reviews. And like all performance reviews, they were stressful, confusing, and never quite explained what you were supposed to do better next time. After blaming emotions on fluids, dreams on divine messaging systems, medieval psychology reached one of its boldest conclusions. If your mind was struggling, you had done something wrong. Mental illness was not a condition. It was not a health issue. It was a character flaw with spiritual consequences. If someone behaved erratically, heard voices, withdrew from society, or lived in constant fear, medieval psychology didn't ask what they were experiencing internally, it asked what sin had caused it. Madness was understood as punishment, possession, or weakness of faith. Sometimes all three, if the situation called for it. This belief was incredibly convenient. If suffering came from moral failure, society didn't need to offer care, support, or understanding. It needed discipline, correction, prayer, and occasionally restraint. People with mental illness were encouraged to confess, repent, fast, or pray harder. If that didn't work, the assumption wasn't that the treatment had failed, it was that the person was resisting divine help. Responsibility always flowed downward. In more extreme cases, individuals were restrained, isolated, or handed over to religious authorities, not for cruelty, but for correction. Medieval psychology truly believed isolation and punishment could bring the mind back into alignment. If someone screamed, it meant the soul was fighting. If someone went silent, it meant the soul was losing. Either outcome was considered progress. It was even a hierarchy of acceptable suffering. Melancholy among scholars was tolerated. Madness among peasants was suspicious. A noble behaving strangely was eccentric. A poor person doing the same thing was dangerous.
Dangerous. Psychology adapted beautifully to social class. The most uncomfortable truth is that medieval psychology wasn't trying to be cruel, it was trying to impose order. A world without explanations is terrifying, so medieval thinkers built explanations that preserved authority and moral clarity. Unfortunately, those explanations turned suffering into guilt. Modern psychology recognizes mental illness as complex, biological, psychological, and social. Medieval psychology saw it as disobedience. And once illness becomes sin, the cure stops being compassion and starts being control. Medieval society was very good at control. After deciding mental suffering was a moral failure, medieval psychology moved on to fear, and immediately concluded that fear was not an emotion at all. It was a mechanical failure. Fear didn't come from danger, uncertainty, or the perfectly reasonable awareness that medieval life was horrifying. Fear came from weak blood flow. According to medieval thinkers, courage was the result of warm, fast-moving blood circulating bravely through the body. Fear happened when blood cooled, slowed, or retreated inward, as if it had lost confidence. A frightened person wasn't cautious, they were poorly circulated. This explained everything medieval society already believed. Brave men were hot-blooded, cowards were cold, literally. Fear caused the heart to shrink, the limbs to tremble, and the face to pale, all signs that the vital spirits were fleeing the battlefield. Medieval psychology looked at fear and said, "Ah yes, your blood has abandoned you." Treatment followed predictable logic. To cure fear, you had to warm the body and stimulate circulation. Hot food, wine, spices, physical exertion, occasionally yelling at the frightened person until they improved. If you were afraid, you weren't offered reassurance, you were encouraged to toughen up metabolically. Soldiers who panicked in battle weren't considered traumatized, they were defective. Their blood was weak, their hearts were cold. Fear was not a survival instinct, it was a personal failure with biological implications. Women were considered more fearful because they were colder by nature. Children were fearful because their bodies were unfinished. The elderly were fearful because their heat was fading. In every case, fear was framed as physical decline rather than emotional response. What medieval psychology never considered was that fear is often intelligent. Fear keeps you alive. Fear tells you when something is dangerous. Fear is information. But admitting that would have required acknowledging that panic in a plague-ridden city might be reasonable, and medieval psychology did not reward reason. Even nightmares were tied to fear's physicality. If you woke trembling, it meant your blood had cooled too much during sleep. The solution wasn't comfort, it was warmth. More blankets, more food, less thinking. Always less thinking. Modern psychology treats fear as a protective response. Medieval psychology treated it as a circulation problem. And honestly, given the lack of safety equipment, fear may have been the healthiest instinct people had, even if medieval science spent centuries trying to beat it out of them. After blaming emotions on fluids, temperature, morality, and blood flow, medieval psychology reached what it considered its final, irrefutable explanation. The planets did it. According to medieval belief, your personality, emotions, and mental stability were shaped by the position of celestial bodies at the moment you were born. Not metaphorically, literally. Mars didn't symbolize anger, it installed it. Saturn didn't suggest melancholy, it delivered it, signed, sealed, and guaranteed. This meant your mind wasn't fully yours, it was leased. Astrology wasn't fringe thinking, it was mainstream psychology.
Scholars, physicians, and clergy agreed that the heavens shaped human thought the way the moon shaped the tides, just with more paperwork and fewer refunds. If you were anxious, Mercury was misbehaving. If you were aggressive, Mars was nearby. If you were sad, Saturn had parked itself in the wrong house. And if your life was falling apart entirely, congratulations, you were born at an inconvenient time. Birth charts were treated like psychological profiles. Doctors consulted them before diagnosing, kings consulted them before ruling, parents consulted them to explain why one child was calm and the other was like that. The beauty of astrology was that it explained everything while absolving everyone. Your temper wasn't your fault, your sadness wasn't your fault, your terrible decisions weren't your fault. It was written in the stars. Accountability floated somewhere between Jupiter and nowhere. Even treatment depended on astrology. Certain days were better for bloodletting, purging, or emotional correction. Performing medicine under the wrong planetary alignment could make things worse, which was impressive considering how bad things already were. Planetary influence could wax and wane. You might be emotionally stable one month and unhinged the next, simply because Venus had moved. Why improve yourself when the universe might fix it next Tuesday? Modern psychology studies biology, patterns, and environment. Medieval psychology studied the sky and said, yes, that explains your personality. Today, astrology is entertainment. In medieval society, it was therapy, diagnosis, and an excuse generator. If nothing else, it was comforting. Your problems weren't random, they were cosmically scheduled. After outsourcing your personality to the planets, medieval psychology decided to look inside the human head without actually opening it and announced another breakthrough. The brain is a building. A very small, very damp building with designated rooms for thinking. According to medieval scholars, the brain was divided into chambers, each responsible for a different mental function. Memory lived in one room, imagination in another. Reason occupied the front, because, of course, reason wanted a window. If one room malfunctioned, that explained everything. This model was taken very seriously. If you forgot things, your memory chamber was weak. If you hallucinated, your imagination room was unsupervised. If you made bad decisions, your reason chamber was poorly furnished. Mental illness was now an interior design problem. Medical texts described these chambers in impressive detail, despite no one having ever seen them. The front handled reason, the middle handled imagination, the back stored memory, which explained why head injuries were terrifying. A blow to the wrong spot didn't just hurt, it redecorated your mind. Medieval psychology believed these chambers could be physically affected by diet, emotion, and weather. Cold air made the brain too moist. Heat dried it out. Excess thinking overheated specific rooms. The brain, in medieval theory, was essentially a medieval house with terrible insulation and a constant mold problem. This belief shaped treatment. To improve memory, doctors prescribed herbs, prayer, repetition, and strong smells, because nothing sharpens recall than being aggressively incensed. If imagination ran wild, patients were told to reduce stimulation, avoid stories, and stop thinking creatively. Medieval psychology considered this a perfectly reasonable request. Education followed the same logic. Learning too much, too fast, was dangerous. You might overload a chamber. Better to memorize slowly, cautiously, and under supervision. A mind bursting with knowledge wasn't impressive. It was structurally unsound. Modern neuroscience maps networks and processes. Medieval psychology drew floor plans. And while the idea of mental rooms sounds ridiculous now, it gave medieval thinkers something they desperately wanted: control. If the mind had structure, it could be managed. If it could be managed, it could be corrected, even if the structure was imaginary.
The blueprint was completely imaginary. After medieval psychology carefully explained where your memories were stored and which room imagination was misbehaving in, it turned its suspicious gaze toward happiness and immediately decided that too much joy was a medical risk.
Yes, being happy was fine. Being very happy was deeply concerning. According to medieval thinkers, intense joy overheated the heart, and an overheated heart was dangerous. The heart, remember, was not just a pump, it was the emotional command center. If joy became excessive, the heart expanded, spirits rushed, balance collapsed, and sudden death politely showed up uninvited. This meant medieval psychology genuinely warned people against excitement. Sudden good news was risky. Laughter required moderation. Celebration demanded restraint. If someone experienced overwhelming happiness, doctors advised calm, rest, and emotional cooling, because joy, left unchecked, could kill you faster than sadness ever did. Medieval texts were filled with examples meant to terrify readers into emotional moderation, stories of people who laughed themselves to death, people who collapsed from excitement, people who received wonderful news and immediately expired. Whether these stories were exaggerated, misunderstood, or completely fictional did not matter. They were cited confidently, and confidence was medieval psychology's strongest instrument. Even love-related happiness was dangerous. Too much delight in romance could weaken the body. Passion stirred the spirits too aggressively. A joyful heart was a reckless heart. The safest emotional state, according to medieval wisdom, was calm contentment with a light sprinkle of concern. This belief made emotional restraint virtuous. A composed person was healthy. A visibly joyful person was suspicious. Someone laughing loudly in public was either drunk, sinful, or moments away from collapse. Monastic life reinforced this idea. Excess emotion, joy included, disrupted spiritual focus. Smiling too much could indicate pride. Laughter might invite temptation. Medieval psychology quietly suggested that serenity was the only safe emotional speed. Modern psychology encourages joy, connection, and emotional expression. Medieval psychology encouraged emotional cruise control. And in a world where happiness could be taken away at any moment by disease, famine, or war, distrusting joy may have felt logical. If you never let yourself feel too happy, you never risked losing it. It wasn't optimism, it was emotional risk management. And medieval psychology was very, very risk-averse, especially when it came to smiling too hard. After medieval psychology decided that too much happiness could kill you, it turned its attention to children and made another confident conclusion. Children were not fully human yet. Not metaphorically, literally incomplete, like unfinished furniture that hadn't set properly. Medieval thinkers believed children were governed almost entirely by moisture. Their bodies were soft, wet, and unstable. Their minds were worse. A child's brain, according to medieval psychology, had not hardened enough to support proper reason. This explained everything: tantrums, curiosity, impulsiveness, and the habit of asking inconvenient questions. Children weren't seen as developing psychologically, they were seen as lacking structure. Their thoughts slipped, their emotions overflowed, their attention wandered. None of this was considered normal development, it was considered evidence of deficiency. As a result, emotional expression in children wasn't explored or nurtured, it was corrected. Loud laughter, excess spirits, crying, weak control, fear, curiosity, dangerous thinking. Childhood was not a stage to be understood, it was a condition to be managed. Education reflected this belief. Learning focused heavily on memorization and obedience. Imagination was discouraged because it strengthened the wrong brain chamber. Too much play was wasteful. Too much questioning was suspicious. A good child was quiet, compliant, and emotionally restrained, essentially a small adult with worse coordination. Discipline was harsh, not because medieval parents were uniquely cruel, but because psychology supported it. If children were unstable, then firmness created structure. pain was instructional, fear was corrective, affection was optional. Even affection itself was treated cautiously. Too much warmth might spoil a child's temperament. Too much comfort might prevent the humors from settling properly. Medieval psychology believed resilience came from restraint, not support. And because children were seen as unfinished, their emotions were rarely taken seriously. A child in distress wasn't anxious or overwhelmed, they were misaligned. The solution was correction, not conversation. Modern psychology sees childhood as foundational. Medieval psychology saw it as a problem to survive. Children weren't encouraged to grow emotionally, they were expected to harden. And in a world that demanded endurance above all else, medieval psychology believed it was doing them a favor, even if it never once asked how the children felt about it. After medieval psychology decided that children needed hardening rather than nurturing, it turned to adults and announced another solution to mental distress: stop talking. Silence, according to medieval thinkers, was not just polite, it was therapeutic. Words stirred the mind, thoughts followed words, emotions followed thoughts, and emotions, as we've established, were dangerous, damp, overheated, morally suspicious, and probably full of bile. Therefore, silence was medicine. Monastic psychology perfected this idea. Monks believed speech scattered the mind, while silence gathered it back into order. Talking too much weakened reason. Joking was risky. Complaining was spiritually corrosive. Silence allowed thoughts to settle, humors to calm, and the soul to stop doing whatever it had been doing wrong. Even outside monasteries, medieval psychology encouraged restrained speech. A quiet person was considered wise. A loud person was considered unstable. Someone who spoke passionately or emotionally wasn't expressive, they were imbalanced. Excess words meant excess thought. Excess thought led directly back to madness. Silence was especially recommended for people experiencing distress. Feeling anxious? Be silent. Feeling sad? Be silent. Feeling angry? Definitely be silent. Medieval psychology believed speaking about emotions amplified them, like blowing on a fire. Suppression wasn't repression, it was maintenance. This belief also made silence a moral virtue. Quiet people were disciplined, loud people were suspect. Speaking out, especially against authority, wasn't framed as dissent, it was framed as psychological instability. If you objected too strongly, perhaps your humors were acting up. Women were encouraged towards silence more than men. Emotional speech was seen as proof of instability. Silence was framed as protection. Medieval psychology didn't silence people by accident. It medicalized silence. And to be fair, silence sometimes helped. In a chaotic, noisy world, quiet moments probably did calm the mind. But medieval psychology didn't recommend balance. It recommended suppression. Modern psychology encourages expression, reflection, and communication. Medieval psychology encouraged quiet obedience. Silence wasn't about understanding yourself, it was about containing yourself. And in a society obsessed with order, silence was the most efficient mental health tool they had, even if it solved nothing and taught people to suffer quietly. After medieval psychology explained emotions with fluids, fear with circulation, joy with heart explosions, and silence as therapy, it arrived at its grand unifying theory. The mind did not exist on its own. There was no such thing as mental health. There was only spiritual alignment. Thoughts, emotions, behaviors, all of it was inseparable from the soul. If your mind struggled, your soul was out of order. If your emotions overflowed, your soul lacked discipline. If you felt despair, confusion, or anxiety, medieval psychology didn't ask what happened to you, it asked what you had failed to do. This made psychological suffering incredibly easy to explain and incredibly hard to escape. If the mind was simply a reflection of spiritual health, then the solution was not understanding, support, or care. The solution was obedience, prayer, repentance, moral correction. Mental distress was treated the same way moral failure was treated, with instruction and control. This belief wrapped every psychological concept we've discussed into one airtight system. Sadness wasn't an emotion, it was spiritual imbalance. Anger wasn't frustration, it was moral heat. Fear wasn't instinct, it was weakness of faith. Joy wasn't relief, it was spiritual risk.
The blueprint was completely imaginary. After medieval psychology carefully mapped where memories were stored and which room imagination was misbehaving in, it turned its suspicious gaze toward happiness and immediately declared it a potential medical emergency. Happiness itself was acceptable. Too much happiness was not. According to medieval thinkers, intense joy overheated the heart, and an overheated heart was dangerous. The heart, after all, was not merely a pump. It was the emotional command center. When joy became excessive, the heart expanded, spirits surged, balance collapsed, and sudden death arrived without bothering to knock. This meant medieval psychology genuinely warned people against excitement. Sudden good news was risky. Laughter required moderation. Celebration demanded restraint. If someone experienced overwhelming happiness, physicians advised rest, calm, and emotional cooling, because joy, left unchecked, could kill faster than sorrow ever did. Medical texts were filled with cautionary tales meant to terrify readers into moderation. People who laughed themselves to death, people who collapsed from excitement, people who received wonderful news and immediately expired. Whether these stories were exaggerated, misunderstood, or entirely invented was irrelevant. They were cited with confidence, and confidence was medieval psychology's most powerful tool. Even happiness rooted in love was suspect. Too much delight weakened the body. Passion stirred the spirits too aggressively. A joyful heart was a reckless heart. The safest emotional state, according to medieval wisdom, was calm contentment lightly dusted with concern. Restraint became virtue. Composure meant health. Visible joy raised suspicion. Someone laughing loudly in public was assumed to be drunk, sinful, or seconds away from collapse. Monastic life reinforced this outlook. Excess emotion disrupted spiritual focus. Smiling too much hinted at pride. Laughter invited temptation. Medieval psychology quietly concluded that serenity was the only safe emotional speed. Modern psychology encourages joy, connection, and expression. Medieval psychology preferred emotional cruise control. And in a world where happiness could be erased overnight by disease, famine, or war, distrusting joy may have felt practical. If you never let yourself feel too happy, you never risked losing it. This wasn't pessimism, it was emotional risk management. And medieval psychology was aggressively risk-averse, especially when it came to smiling too hard. Once it decided happiness itself could be lethal, medieval psychology turned its attention to children and reached another confident conclusion. Children were not fully human yet. Not symbolically, literally unfinished, like furniture that hadn't set properly. Medieval thinkers believed children were governed almost entirely by moisture. Their bodies were soft, wet, unstable. Their minds were worse. A child's brain, according to medieval psychology, had not hardened enough to support reason. This explained tantrums, curiosity, impulsivity, and the deeply troubling habit of asking questions. Children were not viewed as developing psychologically, they were viewed as structurally deficient. Their thoughts slipped, their emotions spilled, their attention wandered. None of this was considered normal development. It was evidence of incompleteness. As a result, emotional expression in children wasn't explored or nurtured, it was corrected. Loud laughter, excess energy, crying, fear, curiosity, imagination, all symptoms of instability. Childhood was not a phase to be understood, it was a condition to be managed. Education reflected this belief. Learning emphasized memorization and obedience. Imagination was discouraged because it strengthened the wrong mental chamber. Play was wasteful. Questions were suspicious. A good child was quiet, compliant, and emotionally restrained. Essentially, a small adult with poor coordination. Discipline was harsh, not because medieval parents were uniquely cruel, but because psychology justified it. If children were unstable, firmness imposed structure, pain instructed, fear corrected. Affection was optional. Even affection itself was treated cautiously. Too much warmth spoiled temperament. Too much comfort prevented the humors from settling correctly. Resilience, medieval psychology insisted, came from restraint, not support. Because children were unfinished, their emotions were rarely taken seriously. A distressed child wasn't anxious or overwhelmed, they were misaligned. The solution was correction, not conversation. Modern psychology sees childhood as foundational. Medieval psychology saw it as something to endure. Children were not encouraged to grow emotionally. They were expected to harden. And in a world that demanded endurance above all else, medieval psychology believed this was kindness, even if it never once asked how children felt about it. After deciding children required hardening rather than care, medieval psychology turned to adults and proposed another solution to mental distress: stop talking. Silence, medieval thinkers believed, was not merely polite, it was therapeutic. Words stirred thought, thought stirred emotion, emotion disturbed the humors, and disturbed humors led directly back to disorder. Therefore, silence was medicine. Monastic traditions perfected this logic. Speech scattered the mind, silence gathered it back into order. Talking too much weakened reason. Joking was risky. Complaining corroded the soul. Silence allowed thoughts to settle, humors to cool, and the soul to stop misbehaving. Outside monasteries, the same belief persisted. Quiet people were wise. Talkative people were unstable. Emotional speech was not expression, it was imbalance. Too many words meant too many thoughts. Too many thoughts led straight to madness. Silence was especially prescribed for distress. Anxious? Be silent. Sad? Be silent. Angry? Absolutely be silent. Medieval psychology believed speaking about emotions fed them, like blowing air onto a flame. Suppression wasn't repression, it was maintenance. Silence became moral virtue. Quiet meant disciplined. Loud meant suspect. Speaking against authority wasn't disagreement, it was psychological instability. If you objected too strongly, perhaps your humors were acting up. Women were encouraged toward silence more than men. Emotional speech was evidence of weakness. Silence was framed as protection. Medieval psychology did not silence people accidentally, it medicalized silence. And to be fair, silence sometimes helped. In a chaotic, noisy world, quiet likely did calm the mind. But medieval psychology didn't recommend moderation, it recommended containment. Modern psychology encourages expression, reflection, and dialogue. Medieval psychology encouraged quiet obedience. Silence wasn't about understanding yourself, it was about keeping yourself in bounds. And in a society obsessed with order, silence was the most efficient psychological tool available, even if it solved nothing and taught people to suffer quietly. After explaining emotions with fluids, fear with circulation, joy with cardiac catastrophe, and silence as therapy, medieval psychology reached its final conclusion. The mind did not exist independently. There was no mental health. There was only spiritual alignment. Thoughts, emotions, behavior, all were reflections of the soul. If your mind struggled, your soul was disordered. If emotions overflowed, discipline was lacking.
If you felt despair, confusion, or anxiety, medieval psychology didn't ask what happened to you, it asked what you failed to do. This made suffering easy to explain and nearly impossible to escape. If the mind was merely a mirror of spiritual condition, the solution wasn't care or understanding, it was obedience, prayer, repentance, correction. Mental distress was treated exactly like moral failure, with instruction and control. Every concept collapsed into one sealed system. Sadness was spiritual imbalance. Anger was moral heat. Fear was weakness of faith. Joy was spiritual risk. And because the soul was eternal, suffering was rarely meaningless. It was framed as necessary.
For Rome, Illyria had once been useful, a source of timber, slaves, and access to Adriatic trade routes. Under Queen Tauta, that usefulness became an embarrassment. Illyrian activity at sea stopped looking like a nuisance and started looking like defiance. Roman merchants were attacked with growing boldness. Even worse, Roman authority was being openly ignored. The breaking point came when Rome sent envoys across the Adriatic to confront the Illyrian court. Diplomacy was meant to reassert Roman superiority without bloodshed. Instead, it revealed just how little Tauta feared Roman threats. She refused to curb Illyrian naval practices and allegedly allowed violence against one of the ambassadors on the return journey. Whether the attack was ordered or merely tolerated did not matter. The message was unmistakable. Illyria would not bow. In Roman political culture, such an insult could not go unanswered. Rome was still defining itself as a Mediterranean power, and prestige mattered as much as territory. To allow a foreign queen to challenge Roman authority at sea would signal weakness, not only to Illyria, but to every coastal state watching closely. The Senate responded decisively. What began as a dispute over piracy was reframed as a moral crusade. Rome declared it was not conquering, but restoring order. The First Illyrian War was justified as a necessary intervention against chaos. For Tauta, the declaration of war was not unexpected. She had ruled long enough to understand that power attracts confrontation. Illyria was not defenseless. Its coastline was lined with fortified cities. Its sailors were experienced in rapid strikes and sudden retreats. Its knowledge of local waters was unmatched. For now, the Adriatic was still Illyrian territory. But Rome brought something Illyria lacked: overwhelming resources and relentless organization. Roman fleets crossed the sea with clear objectives, targeting coastal strongholds one by one. Cities that had once relied on Illyrian protection began to hesitate, calculating survival over loyalty. The war marked a turning point. For the first time, Tauta faced an enemy that could not be intimidated by reputation alone. The Adriatic was no longer just a theater of raids and reprisals. It became the front line of a struggle between two visions of power. When Roman fleets appeared along the Adriatic shoreline, the war stopped being abstract. It became daily reality. Ports that had prospered under Illyrian dominance now faced a brutal choice: resist Rome and risk destruction, or defect and survive. For Tauta, this was the most dangerous phase of her rule. Naval power could dominate the sea, but it could not guarantee loyalty on land. Rome advanced methodically. Instead of chasing Illyrian raiders, Roman commanders targeted coastal cities, dismantling the infrastructure that sustained Tauta's fleet. One by one, strongholds fell. Some were taken by force, others opened their gates willingly, gambling that Roman control would be more predictable than Illyrian rule. Tauta responded as Illyrian rulers always had, with speed, intimidation, and geography. Her ships continued to harass Roman supply lines. Narrow channels, rocky shores, and hidden harbors favored sailors who knew every current and inlet. Roman ships, heavier and less agile, struggled in unfamiliar waters, but this advantage could not offset Rome's persistence. Illyrian warfare favored swift blows. Roman warfare favored endurance. Losses were replaced quickly, fleets were repaired, troops returned in greater numbers.
Each Roman success, however small, chipped away at Tauda's authority. The psychological impact was devastating. Illyrian commanders who once acted independently now faced an enemy that punished hesitation and rewarded betrayal. Some local leaders defected, negotiating their own survival. Each defection weakened the illusion of unity that had sustained Illyrian power. As pressure mounted, Tauda withdrew from exposed coastal positions, retreating inland to fortified centers beyond immediate Roman reach. The move preserved her safety, but it signaled something far more damaging. Control of the sea was slipping away. The Adriatic, once ruled by Illyrian ships, was no longer hers. The war revealed a harsh truth. Tauda had mastered Illyrian traditions of power. Rome was fighting a different kind of war, one built on logistics, discipline, and long-term occupation. This was no longer about piracy or pride, it was about survival. As Roman pressure intensified, the war entered its decisive phase. Illyria could still wound Rome, but it could no longer stop it. The steady fall of coastal cities severed Tauda's access to the sea, strangling the source of her authority. Without ports, fleets became liabilities. Rome understood this and pressed relentlessly. Facing the collapse of her maritime network, Tauda made a strategic choice, rooted in survival rather than pride. She entered negotiations, not as a defeated pirate, but as a ruler seeking to preserve what remained of her kingdom. The settlement was severe. Illyria was forced to pay tribute, surrender much of its coastline, and sharply limit its naval operations. Illyrian ships were forbidden from sailing south of a defined boundary without Roman permission. The Adriatic was now regulated by Roman law. Most striking of all was Tauda's removal from power. Whether she formally abdicated or was politically sidelined, her reign ended with the war. Rome installed client rulers more willing to comply, ensuring Illyria would never again challenge Roman shipping with the same confidence. Yet defeat did not erase her legacy. Rome had won militarily, but it had not silenced the significance of her rule. For the first time, Rome had fought a war triggered not simply by conquest, but by resistance. Resistance led by a woman who refused intimidation. Roman historians later portrayed Tauda as reckless and arrogant, framing the conflict as a lesson in order. But beneath that narrative lay an uncomfortable truth. She had forced Rome to take Illyria seriously. Even in defeat, she reshaped the balance of power. The war marked Rome's first major intervention east of the Adriatic, opening the path toward the Balkans and Greece. Illyria became a testing ground for Roman imperial strategy, domination through control rather than annihilation. Tauda disappeared from the historical record after her fall, but her shadow lingered. She ruled at the edge of empire and refused to retreat quietly. Stripped of fleet and crown, she left behind a warning etched into Roman memory. The sea was never truly tamed, and those who challenged it could force even Rome to act.
Rome did not cross the Adriatic because Illyria was insignificant. It crossed because Teuda's policies disrupted trade, challenged Roman authority, and exposed a dangerous vulnerability at sea. In practical terms, she forced Rome to adapt, to build a stronger naval presence, and to rethink how maritime frontiers were managed and defended. The rewriting of her image served a clear political purpose. By casting Teuda as reckless, Roman writers justified future intervention. Resistance could now be labeled piracy. Defiance could be framed as deserter requiring Roman correction. Illyria became an example, a warning to other coastal powers that independence would be punished and remembered unfavorably. Yet, the hostility of Roman accounts preserves Teuda's importance. If she had been weak, she would have been ignored. Instead, she became a symbol of disorder, precisely because she had disrupted Rome's sense of control. Her gender intensified this reaction. A woman exercising naval authority unsettled Roman expectations. It was easier to reduce her to caricature than to confront the implications of her rule. Outside Roman texts, Illyrian voices are almost entirely lost. What remains must be read between hostile lines. There, a different figure emerges, a regent who protected her kingdom's economy, enforced tradition, and ruled decisively in a brutal geopolitical environment. Rome may have written the surviving history, but it did not erase her impact. Even in distortion, her presence endures, etched into Roman memory as a ruler strong enough to demand explanation, condemnation, and justification long after her fall. Stripped of her throne and written into history by her enemies, Teuta might have faded into obscurity. Instead, her story endured precisely because it defied expectations. In a Mediterranean world dominated by male generals and kings, Teuta of Illyria stood apart. Her authority rested not on dynastic ceremony or domestic influence, but on the sea itself. Naval power in the ancient world was rare and difficult to sustain. It required skilled sailors, constant resources, and intimate knowledge of coastal geography. Teuta commanded all three. Her leadership was not symbolic. She governed fleets, directed campaigns, and enforced maritime policy across a fractured coastline. Few rulers of her era, male or female, exercised such direct control over naval warfare. What made Teuta exceptional was not simply that she ruled, but how she ruled. She did not adopt foreign customs or soften Illyrian traditions to appease outsiders. She leaned into local values, autonomy, strength, and maritime dominance. Her authority flowed from action, not rhetoric. Captains followed her because she protected their way of life and rewarded success, yet her gender ensured her rule would be judged differently. Where male rulers were described as ambitious, Teuta was labeled reckless. Where men were strategic, she was portrayed as emotional. These distortions reveal more about Roman anxieties than Illyrian reality. Even within hostile accounts, her competence is impossible to erase. Rome did not face scattered raiders, but a coordinated maritime power capable of disrupting trade across an entire sea. The war against Illyria marked Rome's first sustained step toward naval dominance in the Eastern Adriatic, and it was Teuta who forced that step. Beyond military history, her reign challenges modern assumptions about ancient leadership. Illyrian society, often dismissed as peripheral, produced a ruler capable of confronting the largest republic of the age. She ruled briefly but decisively. She lost, but not insignificantly. Teuta did not merely resist Rome, she reshaped the geopolitical environment Rome would later dominate. Her removal from power did not end Illyrian resistance, but it permanently altered its character. After the First Illyrian War, the Adriatic was no longer a contested frontier governed by local custom. It became a monitored sea, regulated, patrolled, and increasingly Roman. The treaties imposed after her defeat were designed not only to punish, but to prevent any future ruler from rebuilding what she had created. Illyrian ships were restricted in number and movement. Ports were bound to Roman interests through client rulers and garrisons. Trade routes shifted westward. Rome achieved what it had wanted from the beginning, predictable control of maritime commerce. But that control came at a cost. The Adriatic was not naturally submissive. It required constant attention, patrols, and intervention. Rebellions flared repeatedly in the decades that followed, proving Illyrian seafaring culture could be suppressed but not erased. Teuta's war revealed the region's volatility and forced Rome into a long-term commitment it had not originally planned. For Illyria, the aftermath was fragmentation. Without a unifying naval authority, local leaders competed for survival. Some collaborated openly with Rome, others resisted quietly, waiting for opportunities that rarely came. The age of Illyrian dominance at sea was over. Ironically, Teuta's defeat accelerated Rome's transformation into a true Mediterranean power.
The war pushed Rome to expand its navy, refine maritime strategy, and project authority beyond Italy. What began as a response to Illyrian resistance became a rehearsal for later conflicts against Carthage, Greece, and the Hellenistic kingdoms. Her impact outlived her reign. She did not merely lose a war, she forced Rome to grow, adapt, and commit to imperial expansion across the sea. The Adriatic that followed her was quieter, more regulated, and unmistakably Roman. Yet it still bore her imprint. History remembers victors more kindly than challengers, but some figures endure precisely because they resisted overwhelming power. Teuta belongs to that rare category. Defeated and displaced, she remains one of the earliest recorded rulers, male or female, to command naval warfare on a regional scale. Her story survives not because Rome wanted it to, but because it could not be ignored. Her legacy is not conquest, but defiance. She ruled at the edge of history, at the moment Illyria stood on the brink of absorption into empire. Instead of yielding quietly, she asserted sovereignty in the only language that mattered along the Adriatic, control of the sea. Rome removed her. It could not erase what she represented. Every Roman patrol that crossed the Adriatic afterward was, in some sense, an acknowledgement of her challenge. She did not build an empire. She did something rarer. She stood against one while it was still vulnerable. And though Rome prevailed, the fact that it had to fight, explain, and rewrite her story ensures her legacy remains unsilenced by time or conquest.
Jefferson's solution was an expedition unlike anything the young nation had attempted. It would be scientific, diplomatic, and military all at once. At its head, he placed Meriwether Lewis, a trusted aide with an unusual range of skills. Lewis was not merely an officer. He studied astronomy to fix position, botany to catalog unfamiliar life, and medicine to keep men alive far from help. Jefferson personally trained him, ensuring the mission reflected Enlightenment ideals as much as national ambition. Lewis knew he could not do this alone. He chose William Clark, a seasoned frontiersman and soldier with deep experience in wilderness travel and leadership. Though officially ranked below Lewis, Clark functioned as an equal partner, commanding authority through competence rather than title. Together, they embodied Jefferson's vision, reason paired with endurance. The mission's goals were deceptively simple: find a route to the Pacific, chart rivers and terrain, establish an American presence among native nations. Beneath these objectives lay something more urgent. If the expedition failed, the West would remain mysterious and vulnerable. If it succeeded, the United States would claim not just land, but destiny. As Lewis and Clark prepared to depart, they carried more than supplies and instruments. They carried the weight of a nation's expectations. Jefferson was betting that knowledge could secure power, that curiosity could outrun empire. The expedition would soon test whether ideals could survive mountains, rivers, and the unknown. In the spring of 1804, the journey began. From the last edge of familiar American settlement, Lewis and Clark led a small force officially known as the Corps of Discovery up the Missouri River. It was not a dramatic charge into wilderness, but a slow, grinding push against the current, mile after exhausting mile. Every stroke of the oar carried them farther from certainty. The Missouri was both guide and adversary. Its waters twisted unpredictably, clogged with snags, shifting sandbars, and currents that punished any lapse in attention. Progress was measured in effort rather than distance. Men strained on tow ropes along muddy banks, hauling boats inch by inch, while insects swarmed and the sun burned overhead. There was no road to follow, no clear sense of how far the river stretched westward. Despite the hardship, discipline held. Lewis and Clark enforced routine with near military precision. Watches were kept, journals written, specimens collected. Jefferson's instructions echoed constantly in Lewis's mind. This was not merely a journey, it was an experiment in observation.
Plants were pressed, animals described, landscapes sketched, even when exhaustion tempted collapse without record. The expedition also entered a human frontier. Along the river lived native nations who had watched Europeans and Americans appear, disappear, and return with shifting intentions. Some encounters were cautious but cordial. Others were tense, shaped by rumors of expansion and memories of betrayal. Lewis and Clark distributed peace medals bearing Jefferson's image, symbols of a distant authority few truly understood. Beneath gestures of cooperation lay uncertainty. The Corps depended on native goodwill for food, information, and guidance. Every alliance carried risk. Misunderstandings could turn fatal. Trust had to be earned daily, gesture by gesture, word by word. Disease, injury, and isolation tested morale. Yet, remarkably, no one died in the early months. This was not luck alone. Lewis's medical training and Clark's steady leadership kept the expedition functioning where lesser parties might have collapsed. As the Missouri stretched endlessly ahead, one truth became clear: the river would not simply lead them west, it would strip away illusions. The farther they traveled, the more the mission ceased to be a plan and became a test of endurance, adaptability, and mutual trust. Eventually, maps and instruments proved insufficient. Beyond the river lay mountains no American had crossed from the east, climates poorly understood, and nations whose languages and customs were unfamiliar. At this critical moment, the expedition gained one of its most important figures. Sacagawea entered the story not by choice, but circumstance. A young Shoshone woman, she had been taken from her people years earlier and eventually married to Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trader. When Lewis and Clark encountered Charbonneau's camp, they immediately recognized what Sacagawea represented: a bridge. She spoke Shoshone and Hidatsa. She knew the land, and just as importantly, she carried cultural authority the Corps lacked. Her presence transformed how the expedition was perceived. A military unit might provoke suspicion. A group traveling with a woman and her infant son signaled something different. More parties did not bring families. That single detail likely prevented countless hostile encounters. Where weapons created tension, Sacagawea created hesitation, space for curiosity, negotiation, and restraint. Her contributions went beyond symbolism. She identified edible plants when supplies ran low. She recognized landmarks remembered from childhood. When a boat nearly capsized, it was Sacagawea who calmly recovered journals and instruments, preserving the records Jefferson demanded. Survival often hinged on such quiet moments. Yet her role is often simplified. She was not a silent guide pointing westward in legend. She was a young woman navigating pregnancy, motherhood, and trauma while traveling through landscapes shaped by displacement and loss. Her strength lay not in heroics, but endurance. For Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea embodied a reality the expedition could not ignore. The West was not empty. It was lived in, remembered, and claimed long before Americans arrived. As the Corps neared the mountains, she became more than a guide. She became a reminder that survival depended not on domination, but understanding. By the time the Missouri narrowed and strained against rising ground, the truth was unavoidable. Water alone would not carry them to the Pacific. Ahead stood the Rocky Mountains, a barrier far more imposing than anything Lewis and Clark had imagined. From the east, the land had risen gradually. From the west, it would fall violently. Between them lay snow, altitude, and uncertainty. Crossing required horses, not boats. This forced the expedition into a delicate dependence on native diplomacy. Without animals, the mission would end where the river did. Once again, Sacagawea proved indispensable. As they approached Shoshone territory, she recognized familiar landscapes, and in a moment heavy with emotion, was reunited with her people. Through her, Lewis and Clark secured the horses they desperately needed. Even with horses, the Rockies were unforgiving. Trails narrowed, supplies dwindled, winter arrived early, snow swallowed men and animals alike. Food ran scarce. The Corps was reduced to eating roots, candles, and whatever game could be caught in frozen terrain. Morale wavered. Leadership mattered more than ever. Lewis struggled beneath the weight of responsibility. Clark's steady presence kept the men moving. Decisions were no longer theoretical. A wrong turn meant death. A delay meant freezing in place. The mountains did not care about Jefferson's ambitions or national destiny. Navigation relied less on instruments and more on trust. Native guides led the Corps across passes invisible to outsiders. Without that knowledge, the expedition would have been lost. It was no longer charting land for future settlers. It was borrowing survival from those who had lived there for generations. When the Corps finally crossed the Continental Divide, there was no triumphant moment, no clear sign of success. Only exhaustion, thin air, and the realization that the journey west was only half complete. The mountains had not defeated them. They had stripped them down to their core. Beyond the mountains lay rivers flowing west. Canoes replaced horses. For the first time in months, movement felt natural rather than forced. Relief, however, was brief. Hunger had hollowed the men. Boots were shredded, spirits fragile. The rivers, the Clearwater, Snake, and Columbia, cut through steep canyons and roared with rapids powerful enough to shatter boats. Navigation demanded constant vigilance. One misjudged current could scatter supplies or end lives beyond rescue.
Canoes capsized repeatedly, soaking precious equipment and nearly ending the mission outright. Every spill carried the risk of failure. Along the Columbia River, the expedition entered a different world. Villages were larger, trade networks were more complex. Entire societies were organized around the seasonal return of salmon, the lifeblood of the region. The Corps depended heavily on local knowledge, learning how to preserve fish and navigate unfamiliar waters. These encounters were transactional but cautious. News of the Americans had traveled ahead of them, shaping expectations long before they arrived. Disease followed the river. Illness weakened men already stretched beyond endurance. Yet leadership held. Decisions were debated openly. Discipline remained intact. Morale survived through shared hardship. Remarkably, nearly every member remained alive. In an era when exploration often meant mass death, this alone marked extraordinary success. When the smell of salt finally reached them, it did not bring triumph, only disbelief. After months of river and mountain, the Pacific Ocean emerged, gray and endless. The destination existed. The western edge of the continent was real. Winter forced the expedition to stop. Near the coast, they built Fort Clatsop and endured rain, sickness, and isolation. Food grew monotonous. Clothing rotted in constant damp. Yet the pause allowed reflection. Journals were completed, maps refined, specimens cataloged. Survival gave way once more to purpose. Standing at the ocean did not feel like victory. It felt like completion, earned through suffering. The Corps had crossed a continent without losing its core. The land was vast, inhabited, and unforgiving, but navigable through cooperation and resilience. The Pacific marked the end of movement in one direction. Ahead lay the long return east. Winter trapped them on the coast, and when spring finally came, Lewis and Clark faced a sobering reality. Everything had to be crossed again, this time against fatigue, weather, and time itself. Routes could not simply be reversed. Snow lingered longer than expected. Supplies were thin. The men were leaner, weaker, worn by 2 relentless years. Leadership evolved. The Corps split at times to explore additional territory, increasing risk but reflecting hard-earned confidence. They were no longer improvising blindly. They were operating with experience. Tensions surfaced quietly. Lewis, burdened by responsibility, struggled under pressure. Clark's steadiness anchored the expedition once again. Their partnership held where others might have fractured.
Encounters with native nations on the return were shaped by memory. Some welcomed them back, others remained wary, knowing Americans rarely passed through without returning in greater numbers. One accident nearly ended everything. Lewis was shot during a hunting mishap, a reminder that survival remained fragile even after success. He pressed on, wounded but determined. History would not wait. When the Corps finally returned east, they did not see themselves as conquerors. They arrived as witnesses, journals full, maps etched with certainty. The West was no longer imagined. It had been walked, crossed, and survived. Their records transformed speculation into reality. Rivers had courses, mountains had passes. The Mississippi was no longer the edge, only the beginning. But knowledge carried consequences. Maps became claims. Exploration became expansion. Traders followed, then soldiers, then settlers. For native nations, the expedition was not neutral discovery. It was a signal. Though Lewis and Clark often acted with restraint, the future their success enabled would not. Treaties broke. Land was seized. Cultures were displaced. Lewis died young, haunted and isolated. Clark became part of the system that reshaped native life. Sacagawea, essential to the journey, faded into obscurity, remembered as a symbol, but rarely honored for the cost she bore. The expedition proved a final truth. Exploration is never just about discovery. Once a land is unlocked, it can never be closed again.
Knowledge reshapes power, and power reshapes lives. Lewis and Clark opened a door that could not be closed, even if, later, some wished it could be. Their journey stands as both achievement and warning. It proved what cooperation, planning, and endurance could accomplish, but it also revealed how quickly curiosity can turn into conquest. The Corps of Discovery did not intend to transform the continent forever, yet by revealing it, they made transformation inevitable. More than 2 centuries later, the Lewis and Clark expedition continues to echo through American history, not because it was flawless, but because it captured a moment when ambition, possibility, and uncertainty collided. The journey from the Mississippi to the Pacific reshaped how a nation imagined itself and its future. For the United States, the expedition became a foundational myth, exploration driven by knowledge rather than force, curiosity rather than conquest. Lewis and Clark were remembered as symbols of courage, teamwork, and endurance. Their journals turned wilderness into narrative, allowing millions who would never travel west to imagine it vividly. Yet the true legacy is more complex. The expedition stands at the beginning of a long chain of events that defined the 19th century. Mapping and diplomacy evolved into migration. Migration became displacement, and displacement hardened into empire. Sacagawea's story remains central to how the expedition is remembered. She became a symbol, celebrated in monuments and currency, but her real legacy lies in reality, not symbolism. She represented the indispensable role of indigenous knowledge in American exploration, a truth long minimized or ignored. The expedition also reshaped how Americans understood nature itself. It revealed a continent of immense scale and resistance. Rivers did not always lead where expected. Mountains refused easy crossing. Survival depended on cooperation, adaptability, and humility. Lessons learned, then often forgotten. Lewis and Clark themselves gained little peace from their achievement. Fame did not shield Lewis from inner turmoil, nor did it spare Clark from moral compromise as the nation expanded. Their lives remind us that history's turning points rarely reward those who stand at them. Ultimately, the Lewis and Clark expedition was not just a path across land, it was a threshold moment, the instant the American imagination turned decisively westward, and once that turn was made, there was no going back. Rocky terrain favored sheep herding over agriculture, and wool became central to Mediterranean life. Wool provided warmth during cool mornings and evenings while remaining breathable for daytime heat. It could be dyed, layered, and adapted, making it versatile across seasons and social contexts. Greek garments were defined less by cutting or stitching and more by draping. The chiton and himaion were large rectangles of cloth folded, pinned, and belted around the body. This allowed clothing to flow naturally, emphasizing movement and posture rather than rigid structure. The fabric worked with the body, not against it, a simplicity that carried philosophical meaning. Greek thinkers believed harmony arose from proportion and moderation. Clothing mirrored this belief. Beauty emerged from how fabric fell and how the wearer moved. Skill lay not in tailoring, but in the art of wearing cloth. Social distinctions still mattered, but subtly. Length, quality of wool, and color signaled status. Citizens, foreigners, slaves, and women were identifiable through variations, yet basic forms remained shared. Clothing reinforced community while allowing hierarchy to exist within it. Gender shaped drapery. Men's garments allowed freedom for athletics and public life. Women's clothing emphasized coverage and continuity, reflecting social expectations rather than physical limitation. The fabric itself was neutral. Meaning came from how it was arranged. Unlike Egypt, Greek fashion evolved visibly over time. Changes in length, fastening, and layering reflected shifts in taste and politics. Yet drapery remained central, proving adaptation did not require complexity. Greek clothing represents a turning point. Fabric was no longer just protection or status, it became a visual philosophy. Through wool and drape, Greeks expressed their belief that order, balance, and beauty could exist even in the simplest materials, if used with intention. When Rome absorbed the Greek world, it inherited these clothing forms but transformed their meaning. Roman garments were still draped, yet in Rome, clothing became less about philosophical beauty and more about hierarchy, citizenship, and authority. What you wore publicly declared who you were and who you were not. Wool dominated daily life for durability and availability, though linen and silk appeared later. Unlike the fluid Greek approach, Romans imposed rules on dress. Clothing reinforced social order. The toga, reserved almost exclusively for male citizens, was heavy, unwieldy, and impractical. This was intentional. To wear a toga signaled leisure, authority, and civic participation. Slaves, foreigners, and most women were excluded. Tunics formed the foundation of Roman dress. Everyone wore them, but variations indicated status. Stripes, length, and fabric quality mattered. Senators wore broad purple stripes, knights narrower ones. Even color was controlled. Purple dye was expensive and legally restricted, turning fabric into a tool of social power. Women's clothing reflected both status and morality. The stola marked respectable married women, while prostitutes or enslaved women were forbidden from wearing it. Clothing in Rome was prescriptive. It maintained hierarchy, codified social expectations, and controlled appearance. As Rome expanded, foreign fabrics entered elite wardrobes: silk from China, cotton from the East, and exotic dyes. Yet these imports provoked anxiety. Traditional values clashed with innovation. Clothing became a battleground between heritage and globalization. Roman dress reveals a shift in purpose. Fabric no longer just adapted to climate or expressed beauty, it enforced structure, maintained order, and made power visible without a word. While wool and linen shaped the Mediterranean, another textile revolution was unfolding in China: silk. Silk was rare, valuable, and reshaped economics, diplomacy, and social hierarchy. It was cultivated, guarded, and elevated into a symbol of civilization. Silk production demanded precision and patience. Silkworms fed on mulberry leaves and spun delicate cocoons, harvested at just the right moment. The labor-intensive process made silk expensive and associated with power and refinement, not necessity. Chinese clothing emphasized layering and structure. Robes wrapped the body and were secured with sashes, creating order and continuity. Unlike Greek drapery, Chinese garments reflected hierarchy, harmony, and ritual. Rank was encoded directly into fabric. Colors, patterns, and embroidery were regulated. Certain hues were reserved for elites. Wearing the wrong fabric could be a legal or moral violation. Climate still mattered. Silk insulated while remaining lightweight, ideal for varied environments. Linen and hemp served laborers, while silk defined aspiration, smooth, luminous, and instantly recognizable. Silk's influence extended far beyond China. Trade routes, later called the Silk Road, carried silk westward, spreading wealth, ideas, and styles. Clothing became an early vehicle of globalization. Yet silk also reinforced boundaries. Knowledge of its production was tightly controlled. Revealing the process could be punishable by death. In ancient China, clothing reached a new level of meaning. It was adaptation, hierarchy, and ideology made visible. Fabric became a language of order, authority, and civilization, woven carefully to signal exactly where one stood. Global patterns in ancient clothing. As civilizations expanded across deserts, forests, mountains, and monsoon regions, clothing evolved less as a universal trend and more as a series of local solutions. Fabric, cut, and layering responded directly to climate, proving environment shaped fashion as much as culture. Arid regions, mostly Mesopotamia and Near East, favored loose, long garments for sun and sand protection. Linen and lightweight wool allowed airflow. Covering skin was practical survival. Cold regions, mostly northern Europe, relied on wool, fur, and leather. Garments were stitched closer to the body for warmth. Layered tunics, leggings, and cloaks created modular systems adaptable to daily conditions. Monsoon regions, mostly South and Southeast Asia, favored cotton for breathability. Wrap garments enabled movement and ventilation. Minimal stitching reduced discomfort in wet conditions. Climate dictated design before aesthetics. Culture shaped interpretation. Exposure, coverage, and layering reflected labor, religion, and social order. Clothing became a visible expression of how society understood the body's relationship to nature. Trade blurred these boundaries. Wool appeared in warm climates as luxury. Silk reached cold regions as status wear. Even when foreign fabrics were adopted, local styles persisted. Climate pushed back against fashion. Patterns emerged. Ancient clothing did not evolve toward a single ideal. It branched. Each civilization refined garments suited to its environment, then layered meaning on top. Fashion followed function, not the other way around. By the time societies reached stability, clothing had moved beyond survival. Fabric became a language, signaling belonging, belief, and social identity. Tribal affiliation, sacred roles, and gender norms were encoded into garments. Color, pattern, and shape indicated life stage, rank, and moral status. Clothing became memory made visible. It carried layers of social knowledge, allowing individuals to communicate identity silently. As trade networks expanded, textiles carried transformation along with material. Linen from Egypt, wool from the Mediterranean, silk from East Asia, and cotton from South Asia.
Fashion became negotiation between tradition and innovation, local adaptation and global influence. Through clothing, the ancient world expressed survival, hierarchy, ideology, and identity, all woven into the fabric of daily life.
These imported fabrics did not instantly replace local clothing. They were absorbed slowly, often reserved for elites who could afford rarity. Foreign cloth became a symbol, access, wealth, and connection to the wider world. Technology advanced alongside trade. Weaving techniques improved, looms became more efficient, and dye processes allowed deeper, more consistent colors. Embroidery and patterning expanded clothing's visual vocabulary. Garments remained structurally simple, yet their surfaces became expressive, signaling status, taste, and aspiration. This period introduced tension. Traditional societies viewed foreign fabrics with suspicion. New materials threatened established hierarchies and moral codes. Laws sometimes restricted who could wear imported cloth. Silk, purple dyes, and fine cotton became regulated commodities, controlling access to preserve social boundaries. Yet change was inevitable. Climate and practicalities still mattered, but aspiration played a growing role. People wanted what others had. Clothing became a visible marker of participation in something larger than one's community. Hybrid styles emerged, local garments made with imported materials, foreign cuts adapted to local climates. Clothing became layered, not only in fabric, but in meaning. A single garment could reflect environment, trade, identity, and ambition all at once. This transformation did not erase older traditions, it complicated them. Ancient clothing became a dialogue between past and present, between what worked and what was desired. Fabric became history in motion. By this stage, clothing was no longer purely reactive, it anticipated change. Ancient civilizations discovered that what people wore could shape how they saw themselves in relation to the world beyond their horizon. Trade turned clothing into a record of contact. Each thread told a story of distance crossed, skills exchanged, and cultures intertwined. Once those threads were woven together, fashion could never return to isolation. By the end of antiquity, clothing had completed a remarkable transformation. What began as a response to cold, heat, and exposure had become one of the most powerful tools for organizing human society. Fabric no longer simply protected the body, it defined rank, expressed belief, reinforced identity, and communicated belonging without a word spoken. Across civilizations, clothing followed a shared pattern. First survival, then adaptation, then meaning. Each layer built upon the last, never fully replacing it. Even the most elaborate silk robe or ceremonial garment relied on principles discovered thousands of years earlier: insulation, breathability, durability, and fit. What united ancient clothing traditions was not style, but intelligence. Humans read their environment and translated that knowledge into fabric. Climate shaped materials, geography shaped technique, and culture shaped interpretation. Clothing became a mirror of civilization itself. This evolution reveals something deeply human. People did not abandon practicality when embracing symbolism. Instead, they merged the two. The most successful garments worked and communicated at the same time. Ancient societies understood that comfort, identity, and social order could coexist in a single piece of cloth. The legacy of ancient clothing surrounds us today. Modern garments retain ancient principles: layered fabrics, climate-appropriate materials, symbolic colors, and status-driven fashion. What has changed is speed, not purpose.
Fashion cycles faster, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. When we look at ancient clothing, we are not seeing something distant or obsolete. We are seeing the foundation of how humans learned to live together. Every tunic, kilt, robe, and wrap represents an experiment in survival that gradually became an expression of civilization. In the end, ancient clothing tells a quiet but profound story. Before writing, before cities, before empires, humans wrapped themselves in the world around them, and through fabric, they learned not just how to survive, but how to belong.